Imagine a country that has been involved in US politics since the first half of the 20th century. This country has worked with various lobbyists, politicians, PR companies, etc. to promote its interests in the government and general populace. The United States has provided advanced weaponry to said country and even has used its own military force to protect it numerous times. Lastly, this country had major ties to the 9/11 attacks that were purposely hidden to avoid scandal, leading some to believe it was the real culprit, or at least had a major hand in letting the attacks happen, ushering in a new saga of US involvement in the Middle East. Some top minds obsessed with moving vans and dancing might immediately think of Israel, but to the less 4chan-minded thinkers, the answer is obvious: Saudi Arabia. The United States' relationship with Saudi Arabia started, and has more or less remained, as an oil for security partnership originating with the meeting of FDR and King Abdulaziz ibn Saud on the USS Quincy in 1945. A couple of years later, the US would vote on the UN partition of Palestine, followed by official recognition of the State of Israel in 1948, the first to do so. Both of these countries would inevitably lead the US to be more involved in Middle Eastern politics and entanglements. However, I propose that Saudi Arabia has been the more dominant country in shaping US actions in the region. Both countries share a common enemy in Iran, along with its proxies as well as Hussein's Iraq, depending on the time period, and both have spent considerable time and effort lobbying in unique ways to the American government in public. However, the Israeli factor is oftentimes more highlighted than the Saudi. This is not to say that the Saudis control US foreign policy, but if we were to use the same standards that followers of Walton Mearsheimer use in discussing the Israel lobby, we would have to conclude that Saudi is just as much, if not more, in control of US affairs in the Middle East and beyond. Probably the first and only time any kind of explicitly pro-Israel stance beat out the side loyal to the Saudis was the initial recognition of Israel by the US. Arabists in the State Department warned that recognition of Israel would cut off Arab oil, but little was actually done to this effect. Furthermore, an arms embargo was enacted by the US on Israel, and other countries in the region, to remain as neutral as possible to appease the Arab states somewhat. After the Arab-Israel war ended and the reality of the Jewish state settled in, the Saudis, while often being vocally pro-Palestine, had other more pressing concerns regionally. One recurring theme in the Saudi-US relationship was the sale of US arms to the kingdom, usually over the protests of Israel and the Jewish lobby. For example, in 1956, US arms sales to Saudi caused uproar amongst Israel supporters in the US, but continued anyway under Eisenhower to ensure US access to oil and the Dhahran Air Force Base. In the same year, B-26 bombers were secretly transferred to the kingdom, as well as F-86F Sabre fighter bomber jets, surplus from the Korean War, much to the chagrin of Israel. In spite of these arms sales, Saudi could not adequately defend itself and would need US support during Operation Hard Surface to counter Egyptian incursions into the country. The first, but certainly not the last time, US troops would be used in this way. Other instances of this dynamic include the sale of F-15s under Carter, the sale of AWACS under Reagan, more F-15 sales during Operation Southern Watch, all to the chagrin of Israel, which couldn't even stop arms sales to Jordan during the same period, a much less powerful US ally. In spite of these sales, the kingdom threatened to go to other sources, including the USSR, and bought weapons from China, sparking US disapproval. While there was no singularly named Saudi lobby organization, individuals like Fred Dutton or Saudi national Bandar bin Sultan worked to facilitate these and other pro-Saudi measures. Not to mention the aforementioned State Department Arabists, as well as the vast amount of oil companies and defense contractors who had warm relations with the kingdom. This is not to say that the Saudis were not useful and oftentimes were used during the Cold War to quash communist or communist-sympathetic regimes, although this often led to blowback, most famously with the Taliban in Afghanistan. The control of oil prices was also a helpful tool for various presidents to leverage, although usually only done when aligned with Saudi goals, and was often used as a weapon, more famously in the oil embargoes of 67 and 73. The US has since become more and more oil independent, thus leaving the threat of embargo less strong. However, Saudi Arabia still tried to punish the US for this independence when the US revealed its Strategic Petroleum Reserve Program. In addition to this, the kingdom put pressure on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee to whitewash a 1978 report criticizing the Aramco-Saudi relationship, and in 1979, Saudi oil minister Sheikh Yamani was able to pressure Treasury Secretary William Miller to drop a Justice Department antitrust investigation of the same company. Honing in on one previously mentioned key player, Bandar bin Sultan, helps to elucidate the relationship between Saudi and the US further. Bandar's first foray into US politics was his successful lobbying for the sale of F-15s to Saudi Arabia, later directly dealing with Jimmy Carter in the wake of the Iranian Revolution to control oil prices after access to Iranian oil was no longer viable. Bandar would be a mainstay in US politics for 20-plus years, acting as a personal liaison between the two countries. Besides arms deals directly to Saudi Arabia, Bandar advocated for equipping Saddam Hussein with US weapons during the Iran-Iraq War, as a way to protect Saudi Arabia from Iran. The US primarily followed along with this program in spite of Israeli attempts to arm Iran, although both Saudi and Israel were involved in the Iran-Contra scheme, and even after the end of hostilities and Saddam's threats to make fire eat up half of Israel with chemical weapons, the US still provided Hussein with aid after reassurance from Bandar that Iraq would not act out. Direct U.S. involvement at this time could also be seen in the instance of Iranian jets being downed by American-provided F-15s guided by U.S.-manned AWACS systems over Saudi airspace and the escort of Kuwaiti oil tankers with U.S. military ships in the Persian Gulf to ensure the flow of oil. Ironically, this led to the famous USS Stark incident, in which an Iraqi plane fired upon a U.S. ship, killing dozens of crewmen, in a somewhat similar style to the Liberty incident decades prior, followed by a refusal by the Saudis to down the Iraqi jet. Shortly after the Iran-Iraq War, Saddam made incursions into Kuwait, threatening Saudi Arabia. As a result, King Fahd allowed U.S. troops en masse into the kingdom for its defense, sparking the rift between Osama bin Laden and the Saudi royals. All of this was facilitated enthusiastically by Prince Bandar, who wanted American assurance that they were 100% committed to defending the kingdom, utilizing Operation Plan 100290, Defense of the Arabian Peninsula, which was properly enacted following Iraqi threats. Bandar practically became a member of the National Security Council, gaining unprecedented access to U.S. military plans and procedures. At the same time, the Saudis complained of the non-Muslim nature of U.S. military troops, gaining concessions from them to not unduly flaunt their non-Muslim identities. Furthermore, Bandar personally lobbied Congress for war and even lobbied AIPAC to encourage action against Saddam and the U.S. government, promising Saudi leniency on Israel in the future, which did not come to fruition. The war was widely seen as primarily about the defense of Saudi oil and the defense of the Saudi monarchy, one of the major gripes of al-Qaeda. The use of non-Muslim troops in the Islamic Holy Land would become a casus belli for bin Laden, sparking numerous terror attacks culminating in 9/11. The first Gulf War ended quickly, however U.S. troops remained in the kingdom and tensions with Saddam were still high. Bandar would never forgive Saddam for his aggression and would be a key player in the Second Gulf War. In the interim period, the Saudis, after having been close to the Bushes for over a decade, starting in the Texas oil industry and as Reagan's VP under the first Bush presidency, tried to make inroads with Bill Clinton. The Saudis donated millions of dollars to Clinton's alma mater, University of Arkansas, and helped Clinton win re-election by buying Boeing jet planes for Saudia Airlines. This won him Washington state by allowing the purchase to go through after attempts to sell to Iran were put on hold due to the sanctions regime, although the Saudis were not able to pay up front and had to have the purchase underwritten by the U.S. Export-Import Bank. Not everything was smooth sailing for the relationship between Clinton and the kingdom, however, and in 1994, after Iraqi troop movements close to the Saudi border, Clinton advocated a defense plan to the Saudis which they rejected, culminating in the U.S. sending brigades to Qatar, Kuwait, and the UAE instead of more troops to Saudi Arabia. To make matters worse, the Khobar towers were bombed, killing 19 Americans as well as injuring hundreds more Americans and other nationals. The bombings were thought to be done by Saudi Hezbollah, but Saudi Arabia would not let the FBI do any interrogation into the matter. The last significant action undertaken by Clinton in the region was Operation Desert Fox, involving U.S. airstrikes on Iraq from Saudi territory. This was highly praised by Bandar, who was known as a super hawk when it came to Saddam, purportedly much more so than other neocons, including Paul Wolfowitz, according to diplomat Martin Indyk. After the Clinton years, the Saudis were thrilled to see another Bush in office. Monetary ties between the Saudis and the Bushes ran deep, with as much as $1.476 billion having been transferred from the Saudis to the House of Bush and related institutions, including Carlyle and Halliburton. Bush himself had quite a bit of Muslim Arab support during his first election, even garnering support from those later to be charged with acts of terrorism. Ironically, Bush rejected racial profiling of Arabs as a racist practice, which theoretically could have been useful leading up to 9/11. Leading up to that eventful day, Bush was even close to advocating for an independent state of Palestine following Saudi pressure to do so after Bush's support for Ariel Sharon during the Second Intifada. However, this was quickly derailed, and both the US and Saudi Arabia had a much bigger problem on their hands than the IP conflict. Naturally, the Saudis wanted to distance themselves from the attacks, even evoking the modern internet theory culture of blame the Jew by claiming Israel and Mossad were behind 9/11. However, the links to the Saudis were undeniable. Right off the bat, 15 out of 19 hijackers were Saudi nationals. Saudi Arabia's biggest bank, run by Khalid bin Mahfouz, National Commercial Bank of Saudi Arabia, had funding ties that channeled millions of dollars to Islamic charities associated with al-Qaeda. The Saudi royal family also supported bin Laden via similar charities, and even Bandar and his wife, unwittingly, presumably, gave economic aid to Omar al-Bayoumi, who in turn gave the cash to two men who would hijack Flight 77. Furthermore, the Saudis had even forgone extradition offered to them by Sudan of bin Laden, not thinking he was worth the effort at the time, albeit before the 9/11 attacks and other major attacks by al-Qaeda. The ease of the attacks was made all the more so by the close relationship between the US and Saudi Arabia. The Visa Express program that had recently been instituted in Saudi allowed at least one hijacker in and was not even shut down after the fact. Saudi Arabia itself was not helpful in the aftermath in dealing with security issues and information. It refused to allow the US to use the country as a base against the Taliban and did nothing to crack down on terrorism inside or outside of the country, with the former chief of counterterrorism operation for the CIA stating that Saudi gave zero cooperation while tens of millions of dollars were being transferred from that country to al-Qaeda. Similar statements can be garnered from a plethora of other intelligence officials and politicians working on counterterrorism. Bizarrely, the US allowed Saudi nationals in the country, including bin Laden relatives, to leave while all other planes were grounded following the attacks. Attempts to whitewash the Saudis by Bandar included hiring PR firm Corvus, but this failed as the Saudi response, or lack thereof, became impossible to ignore, even denying the right to interview family members of the hijackers. Practically the only thing the Saudis did was to increase oil output to lower costs, helping the economy somewhat. James Risen, in his book State of War, points out that the US basically ignored Saudi complicity and both pre- and post-9/11 was not useful at all, and only really started to crack down in 2003 when they had terror bombings in their own country in Riyadh. Perhaps the most egregious was the 28 pages withheld about the Saudi role in the attacks from the 9/11 Commission report, which have only been recently declassified in 2016. Even within the past year, more evidence has come out pointing to Saudi complicity. Much more can be said about the Saudi role in the attacks, but clearly Saudi connections with the US helped it to not only evade responsibility, but in a sense, facilitate the attacks as well. And while conspiracy-minded types hyper-focus on any crumb of evidence of an inside job or Mossad, strangely don't want to bring up the obvious complicity of our other greatest ally. At least Israelis are generally pro-US in public opinion polls and helped post 9/11 with security, whereas at least at the time of 9/11, Saudi public opinion was harshly anti-American. Previously mentioned was Saudi Arabia's lack of enthusiasm for US efforts in Afghanistan. Similarly, the Saudis did not support the Iraq War in 2003, with one exception, Bandar. The prince never forgave Saddam for the first Gulf War and joined with the neocons to advocate his overthrow, often misleading US officials on Saudi dismissal of the plan. He was so close to Bush that he even heard firsthand about the initial plans to invade Iraq before Colin Powell, and parroted neocon talking points about Saddam's culpability for 9/11. Notwithstanding their initial disapproval of the invasion, although Bandar led the US to believe they were backing it and was able to at least convince King Abdullah to provide logistical support for US troops, the Saudis did indeed advocate for more US involvement in Iraq and the broader Middle East to counter Iran after the occupation was a done deal. Saudi Arabia threatened the US if it left Iraq in 2006, and one memo from a top Saudi official spelled out how the US withdrawal would be a disaster for Saudi in relation to Iran. While many people point to the ire that Israel has towards Iran as the source of many Middle Eastern problems, author Kim Gaddis in her book, The Black Wave, points to Saudi Arabia's rivalry with Iran as the main driver of the destabilization of Middle Eastern affairs since 1979. Quotes from King Abdullah declaring Iran as the source of all problems through Robert Gates help clarify their stance. One can read that book, perhaps for review at a later time is in order, for a more in-depth history on the topic, but even contemporary conflicts and events directly relate to the rivalry. For example, the kingdom took an anti-Assad stance in Syria as part of a proxy conflict against Iran, supporting moderate rebels and anti-Hezbollah groups in the country starting all the way back in 2006. By 2011, with popular uprisings against Assad, Saudi clerics urged a jihad against him, resulting in thousands of Saudis going to the country to fight, backed by hundreds of millions of dollars of Saudi money. Indeed, according to a 2009 WikiLeaks cable, Hillary Clinton remarked that Saudi was generally the biggest funder of Sunni terrorism, with many private citizens funding ISIS, according to a Washington Institute study. More recently, Turkey took on the mantle of the main opposition to Assad, invading the country in 2019 and aiding HTS in his ousting last year. Another proxy war with Iran that Saudi is more directly involved in is its war against Yemen, a conflict that has led to the deaths of hundreds of thousands, including children, from aerial bombardment and starvation. The humanitarian concerns, which by number exceed those in Gaza and Sudan, were not a stumbling block to both the Obama and Trump administrations. Obama approved billions of dollars worth of sales and later aided in refueling Saudi planes at the height of its bombing campaign. US and UK support was crucial for the Saudi war effort, with Saudi Arabia being the #1 buyer of US weapons, and Obama himself having visited Saudi more times than any other country in the region, including Israel. In spite of US support, Saudi Arabia still got mad at Obama for not going hard enough on Iran, expressing displeasure over the JCPOA. One Saudi newspaper editor of a prominent London-based newspaper even remarked that a nuclear Iran threatens us, Saudi Arabia, in the first place before it frightens the Israelis or the Americans. Saudi Arabia also took aim at Obama after his refusal to take out Assad after his use of gas attacks, considered by Obama to be a red line, along with Israel, incidentally. Perhaps Saudi's displeasure at Obama's supposed acquiescence to Iran, who one Saudi official referred to as the head of the snake that needed to be cut off, moved them to support his successor, Donald Trump. The relationship with Trump was even closer. One does not have to wholesale buy into Seth Abramson's Red Sea conspiracy to acknowledge that the Saudis and UAE wanted Trump to win in 2016. The Saudis praised Trump's ending of the Iran nuclear deal and targeted Striker Soleimani, being celebrated as the best friend the royal courts of Riyadh and Abu Dhabi have ever had. A good example of Trump's goodwill towards the Saudis was his overlooking of the murder of Jamal Khashoggi and blocking Congress's attempts at cutting access to U.S. weaponry going to Saudi Arabia in response to his death. Even recent attacks on the Houthis in Trump's second term, leaked via Signal, one can see concern for Saudi oil facilities, while Israel is mentioned as well, but more importantly, Europe is the main benefactor, according to Vance and Hegseth from the strike. I doubt anyone is going to say no more wars for Europe anytime soon, but imagine if they had claimed to be bailing out Israel in the same text. So why am I saying any of this? Well, it seems that for almost all US actions in the Middle East, Israel is not the decisive and sole factor, except in the small confines of Israel proper and the West Bank and Gaza. Clearly, Israel and Saudi Arabia align on certain issues like the threat from Iran, but historically Saudi has had a much larger role in manipulating and guiding US foreign policy in the region, with close personal access to various presidents via Bandar bin Sultan, and the close relationship, personal and financial, that Saudis have had with the US government, using its $750 billion in US assets as leverage to avoid accountability over 9/11 and other links to terrorism. Not to mention the vast influence Saudi Arabia has had in exporting Wahhabi ideology generally, which is hostile to non-Muslims and other versions of Islam, as well as the money it has spent specifically on US universities and Islamic studies programs or departments of Middle East and North Africa, although seemingly outdone by Qatar in recent years. These donations, in my mind, don't account for all the anti-Israel sentiments that can be seen on college campuses, but surely play a part, and clearly have beaten any type of Israeli counter-efforts, if there are even attempts at such at this point, with any Jewish professors on campus probably on average towing the BDS line more than spewing any kind of Hasbara. Sure, it has something to do with group evolutionary strategy or the Frankfurt School. I don't know, running out of options here. I suppose one could say that this is just another way of me playing the whataboutism game, to which I would readily agree. The example of another Middle Eastern long-term ally that has undue influence is just too obvious to miss out on, but seems to be ignored entirely by J.Q. Spergs, much like any other counterexamples or comparisons when any other topic is brought up, but I digress. I can respect honest intellectuals who can at least call a spade when it comes to this issue, like John MacArthur, a longtime critic of Israel, who saw the Saudi lobby as an often overlooked and underestimated player in the game of politics. I can understand the scapegoat mentality that certain Saudis had that led them to blame Jews for 9/11, so perhaps many on the online right use the same methodology, something they often do to accuse Gentile Europeans of blame when it comes to a whole host of other issues, and refuse to see the US as an actual player with its own agency and more as a puppet of Zog machinations, missing the Arab and Muslim forest for the Jewish tree.